So, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Fellow brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace be upon you. Thank you for joining us today. I have a special guest, Faturaza, with me today, and we're going to be discussing assessing the risk of Lady Zainab, assessing the risk of Lady Zainab's actions beyond Karbala. Fatul, thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. And before we perhaps get into the wider discussion, I think it would be nice for the audience to hear a bit about yourself.
Salam Mirtaza, thank you so much for asking me and giving me the opportunity to speak to you and some of the people that are participating in this conference. So a little bit about myself. I'm passionate about risk management and risk theory. I've studied it for quite a few years, and I've also had the opportunity to work in policymaking quite a lot. And my initial few years were in the Home Office's Gender, Sex, Race Equality Unit, where we looked specifically at how there are differences in terms of gender and how that affects people's policies, their decision making. And so I wanted to kind of draw on some of the experience that I have and look at some of Lady Zainab's actions in Karbala from the lens of both risk management and gender studies.
Fantastic. So thank you for that outline. I guess it's we've got this conference going on for 2 days, and where time is quite restrictive. So without further ado, I think we'll move across to the main topic, which again, reminding the audience, is assessing risk, Lady Zainab's actions beyond Karbala.
Great, thank you. So, like you said, we're short in time, so I'm going to try to do a whistle-stop tour of strategic risk management. And trying to understand what the key strategic risks were for Hazrat Zainab, kind of looking at it from today's lens as well, and kind of just what a thought leader she was at her, in the time, and how that can influence us right now. Coming back to some of the elements of her approach, and then finally, obviously, we look at these things through the lens of what does that mean for us today, and kind of what can we do differently in our lives. So those are kind of the 5 main topics that I'm going to try to cover in our discussion today. Okay, let's look a little bit at the historical context. In 17th century AD, Zainab bint Ali, obviously the daughter of Hazrat Ali, the first Imam of Islam, was and the granddaughter of the Prophet. She was in the plains of Karbala, having faced devastating losses in her family, and her family, the children and the women and the Imam that were remaining, were being forced out of their tents. And one way that the enemies were doing this was burning their tents. And she asked the Imam of the time, Imam Zain al-Abidin, what should we do? Should we stay in the tent and risk losing our lives, or should we leave the tents? We don't have any chadars, and risk the indignity of that situation. And the Imam says to her, the most important thing according to Islam is to save our lives. And so with that, she rounds up the women and the children, and they exit these burning tents. And I remember reading this as a child, and as emotive as it was, and as emotional as it made me feel, I didn't fully at that point understand the relevance of this story, as to how I couldn't conceive how this was even a risk issue, how somebody would even ask the question, do we stay alive or do we burn? And then I remember in 2002, an article that I read about how 15 young girls perished in a fire in their school in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. And the main reason for those 15 young girls losing their lives, and there were another 50 girls who were injured, is because this religious state police at the time prevented the girls leaving the building. They actually stopped them from leaving it physically, and they stopped the rescuers trying to rescue the girls because the girls did not have their chadars. And I thought that this example really well illustrates, tragically perhaps, but very effectively, how there is no universal approach. There's no one human way of assessing what risk is, and what is a priority to one person in terms of risk might not be a priority to another. There's also a lot of studies done on how at times of crisis, people's assessment abilities can be very, very different. You know, some people react to stressful situations in a different way than others do. And therefore, I really want to look at Hazrat Zainab's stance and her approach, and some of the statements that she made, to understand a little bit more about risk management from a feminist perspective. Okay, so before I talk about Hazrat Zainab's perspective and what we can see from that, let's really quickly cover what exactly is strategic risk management. Now, you know, you see every successful company, every successful individual, and states as well, have a really good approach to strategic risk management. And they're systematic in recognizing, well, maybe I should go on to the next slide. If I go on to the next slide, I think I can illustrate it with a point in the interest of time. So in order to manage your risks, there's kind of a logical step process that you need to pursue. Firstly, risk identification. And here I'm using an example of Imam Hussein's actions because they're obviously tangential to what Hazrat Zainab does in the future. So first things first, we identify a risk, and Imam Hussein identifies a risk, which is Islam at his time is being distorted, and the religion of his grandfather is under threat. So this was his core risk. So first things first, in strategic risk management, you have risk identification. Second step, you understand the cause of the risk. And in this case, Imam Hussein attributes what's going on. And of course, remember, there are loads of risks and there are loads of reasons, but we're looking at just one simple step process, so that if an individual decides to carry out the exercise themselves, you can think about how you do it, and you would do it line by line. And the second one is the cause of the risk. So Imam attributes the main cause of the risk being that the political leadership is tyrannical, they are corrupt, and they do what they want to do. And this is, you know, causing huge risks for what will happen to Islam in the future and what it would look like. And so that leads me to thirdly, what is the effect or the impact of the risk? And Imam says that, you know, if he doesn't do anything, people will lose hope and the true religion of Islam will be forgotten. And then finally and fourthly, once you've worked out, you know, what your risk is, what the cause is, what the effect is, it's quite simple to then decide, well, what is your response going to be? And it's at that point that Imam Hussein decides that he's going to stand up against Yazid and, if necessary, sacrifice everything in order to save Islam. So let's move on to the next slide. Right. Imam Hussein says, the aim of my revolution is to reform society and revive the true teachings of Islam. This leads us to, therefore, in order to make this aim a success, what are Hazrat Zainab's strategic aims and strategic risks? Let's go on to the next slide. And I think the easiest way of summarizing the core risks, of course, there were many, many risks, but her core risk was that the revolution that her brother had started should be successful. And anything that could cause that to be less successful was a risk for her. And the way she identified those risks were, there were probably four key categories. Number one, that deletion, and that is the message that Imam Hussein was proposing about being able to stand up for tyranny, about, you know, supporting the true principles of Islam would just be forgotten. I mean, we all remember that at the time Karbala was not a city center in any sense. You know, it was about 70 kilometers or miles. I have to get back to you on that one, from Kufa. So it was almost a barren place. And it could have been very easy for a battle to take place there, and people actually forget that anything had happened at all. You know, there have been hundreds and thousands of battles in history that resulted in exactly the same fate, especially in remote areas like that. So the first risk that Hazrat Zainab needed to take into account is a complete deletion of the message, and that, people would not know it had even happened. Secondly, we've got disregard. So people might have known that something happened in the plains of Karbala, but they could easily choose to forget it. I know that there are some famous scholars who write about what is a significant difference between Ghadir and Karbala. And, they say that the fact is that Hazrat Ali did not have a sister like Zainab to remind everybody of Ghadir in the same way. So people could have recognized that the events in Karbala took place, but decided that, okay, that happened, that was the past, and we can move on. The state was trying its best to sort of turn the entire event into a political disagreement between two leaders, which had a negative outcome for the Imam. So the entire thing could have been disregarded that way. Thirdly, the message could have been diluted. So everything that Imam stood for in terms of promoting personal freedoms, in terms of standing up for against tyranny, could have been, in some ways, the message could have moved from those core themes to becoming something completely different. For example, it could have been that Yazid's political machine was very much arguing that Imam Hussein just wanted to cause dissent. He just wanted to cause problems for the emir of the time. So there was a lot of attempts to dilute the message and turn it into something that people would not have understood. So this was also a key risk for Hazrat Zainab. And then distortion is very similar to diluting it. So diluting is when you make something seem less important than it is, and distorting it is when you make it about something that it's not. So these were all strategic risks that Hazrat Zainab had to face when she was considering how to message the story of Karbala. Can we move on to the next slide, please?
Yeah, I mean, just before we move on, so the strategy you presented here, looking at the 4 key areas, they're only looking at it from Bibi Zainab's perspective.
Absolutely.
On the night of Sham Ghariba, for example, when Bibi Zainab takes on the role of several different characters, so she takes on the role of Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam, doing the safeguarding the camp, and she takes on the leadership role from for Imam Zain al-Abidin, for example. So from that perspective, what risk did she have to look at and take into consideration from these different roles? Because normally, obviously, when we're looking at strategy, when we're looking at risk and strategy within a business, we look at it with one overarching goal, and perhaps from one role perspective. Whereas obviously for Bibi Zainab, when she's now taken on this mantle post the sacrifice and in Sham Ghariba, what elements of strategy did she have to take on and understand from the different roles she took on that evening?
Okay, so definitely she had a very multivariate approach to how she handled risk. And I'm not sure, maybe the second slide touches on it slightly. Is it called risk ownership? Let's see if I remember correctly. No. Okay, so there was a risk ownership slide, which probably will come a bit later. That's fine. So, you're right. When when all the battles had been finished and finalized, and she was left alone protecting the women and children of the camp, there's a very famous couplet where she has an asa or a stick, and somebody walks towards her and she says, do not come closer, I'm enough to protect this family. And there she's showing again, a stick historically is not a weapon. It is a defensive tool, but she's making a very bold statement there that I, with this defensive tool, am enough to protect the physical, or protect the family against any sort of physical risk. Equally, when she makes decisions with Imam Zain al-Abidin, there's some key decisions that she makes. For example, when Yazid says to the Imam, it says way in the future that we want you to return to Medina, Imam says very clearly that I need to talk to my aunt in order to determine how and when we go. showing very much how she is part of the decision-making process and part of the strategic decision-making process. So Hazrat Zainab takes on different roles at different points, but primarily, I think what I'm trying to argue here is that her core function was the messaging of Karbala and supporting her brother's aim of making sure that this message is not forgotten. She has to take on many other points. At some point, I think I want to come back to the risk ownership slide, and I think I'll be able to illustrate what I'm saying a little bit better, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, let's move on.
Okay, so now we have gender studies and risk. Okay, and I think this is important. Okay, here we have risk ownership. I knew it was coming at some point. And Hazrat Zainab was very cognizant of kind of where her responsibilities lie directly, where she has to lead and where she has to contribute. One clear example is, obviously Hazrat Zainab is an expert when it comes to Quranic studies, and she knows that when it comes to saving the lives of the imam or saving imamate, that is something that God has clearly stated in the Quran, that imamate is going to be around till the end of time. And therefore, although she plays a complementary role in protecting the life of the imam, we know for a fact there are several examples when she throws herself on the imam to stop anybody being able to attack him. That is not her core strategic risk. That risk is owned by Allah, and obviously Allah has no risk because Allah is powerful over everything. It's something that she kind of knows that she facilitates, but it's not her responsibility. Does that make sense? So
if we looked at it from a racy chart in a sense of responsible
exactly she is not responsible for that Allah has taken the responsibility for imamate, and I think it's a really important thing when we're looking at our risk management strategy in our own life to understand which risks we own and which ones we facilitate or contribute. Secondly, again, when it comes to decision making, that is something, coming back to the example of the burning tents, Hazrat Zainab was a brilliant decision maker. She could have very easily herself said, no, you know what, we're going to save our lives and we're going to exit the tent despite the fact that we do not have our chadars. She doesn't do that. She goes to the imam and she asks him to make that decision. And by doing so, she's demonstrating when it comes to these kind of things, it's not about her opinion. It is very much Islamic tenet or Islamic philosophy. And therefore, it is the imam that's making that decision, which is life is more important, the most important thing. This has ramifications for women in gender studies to date. We look at things where there are wars going on right now, and families kill their children, they kill their women because they'd rather preserve their honor than have them, subjected to what enemy forces might do to them. So if Hazrat Zainab had taken that action herself, it would have been a gray area, was it? But because Imam Zainul Abidin was asked to make that decision, it shows very clearly that this is an Islamic stance, that preserving human life is the most important thing. So Hazrat Zainab is very cognizant of kind of where and how she needs to make sure the right risk owner is identified, and her core focus is on promoting the message of Imam Hussein. Okay.
So do we think that if perhaps Bibi Zainab was removed from the equation of the risk management from this perspective, and we removed her from the equation, and it was Imam Zainul Abidin in her place, what are your thoughts around what would have how things would have potentially materialized from that perspective?
Okay.
Especially given the fact that obviously previously you've mentioned the four strategic risks that she had in terms of dilution and deletion, etc. So if we remove Bibi Zainab from the equation in its entirety and she's not part of the decision-making process, then how could things materialize differently?
Okay, well, that's a huge hypothetical question, and I don't think we can conceive what Karbala would be like without Bibi Zainab and her strategic leadership and her risk management. But I just want to give one example. Again, coming back to when Yazid informs Imam Zain al-Abidin that as prisoners they're going to be released and that they should leave for Medina. Imam says, when he asks Bibi Zainab what we should do, she gives a message, which is that we as a family have not had the chance to mourn our beloved martyrs, and we want to do that. And we want to do that here in Damascus. And she sets out these conditions where Yazid has to give her like a large domestic residence where they hold the first majlis. And it's Bibi Zainab that gives the first majlis or holds the first majlis, and it's Imam Zain al-Abidin who sits and he listens, but it's the women of Banu Hashim, of the other tribes who come and listen to the majlis. And I think that's a really, really important point where, again, Imam is also suggesting that when it comes to message transmission and getting the key facts of Karbala across, it is the women that play an instrumental role in this. And it was, again, the women who listen to the majlis who go in and inform their families of what have happened, and the revolution starts. So I think that to underplay any of Hazrat Zainab's role would be a big mistake. Of course, God forbid, if Hazrat Zainab was not there, Imam Zain al-Abidin would have pivoted his approach. He equally gave some really, really fundamentally challenging speeches in Sham, and of course in Yazid's Darbar, in Kufa. But what you see, it's almost like a tag team where we have Hazrat Zainab's speech, and again she covers kind of the importance of the Ahl Bayt, the tragedy in terms of what has happened to them, the unjustness of the situation, how they have not done anything to the people who have done this to them, and Imam Zain al-Abidin echoes these points. So it's very much a complementary message. There's no difference, I would say, in the messaging. But again, loads of studies, if you look at psychology right now, tell us that when it comes to message transmission, women tend to be a bit more effective at it. There's psychology studies that show that people remember a message more if they hear it in a woman's voice versus a guy's voice. Maybe that's why your sat navs are often in a girl's voice. There's other messages about the fact that, if a woman hears something, she'll tell 20 people, whereas if a guy hears a message, she'll tell 2 or 3. So there's a lot of reasons why we're reliant specifically on Hazrat Zainab in making this messaging so effective so quickly. And maybe we can move on to the... Go on, sorry.
It probably leans quite to the point that effective leadership is understanding your strengths and weaknesses, and understanding which players in any organization perhaps potentially will have the ability to drive you forward in the best and most appropriate manner. And I guess one of the key things in this conference itself is understanding what we can learn from Karbala in the modern world and in the modern day, and understanding those key relationships and how you play off relationships and strength is probably what we can learn in our day-to-day lives as well. Absolutely
Play to your strengths. Okay, so let's now look a little bit at attitudes to risk. And current risk theory kind of categorizes people into 3 camps. Risk seekers, those are people who enjoy taking risks. Those are the kids who jumping off bungee jumping things, I don't even know what they're called, or motorcycle racing, or people who actively enjoy pursuing high risk activities. Then you have people who are risk neutral, and they're pretty good at assessing the pros and cons of a risk and do it without kind of perhaps letting some of their own personal emotional biases affect their decisions. And then you have people who are risk averse. They don't like uncertainty, and therefore they will actively avoid risks. And an interesting thing in economic theory is that actually we don't have, the world is not neatly divided into 33% of each. People are more likely to be either risk seekers or risk averse, and the smallest category is actually people who are risk neutral, which is very interesting because for many other things, you find that that most people center towards the average, and therefore you'd expect to find people who are more risk neutral, but that is simply not the case. Okay.
So where do we see Bibi Zainab's actions on this spectrum?
Let's take a look at some of her quotes and kind of see where we would put her. But before we do that, I want to look at what risk and gender studies say. So traditionally, I mean, now if you look at a lot of academic theory, the whole notion of gender is challenged. People would be like, there is no such thing as gender. But if we look at traditional studies, there's a lot of comparison between how men and women view risk. And most of the studies suggest that women are much less likely to take risks than men. They have a heightened sense of fear, and because of that, they're more likely to be risk averse. And also, they're more sensitive to pressured situations. So if a woman is kind of risk averse when there's no pressure, she's more likely towards being even more frightened or even less likely to do something under a high pressured situation. Now, these are the traditional studies. We have some more recent studies which say things like, actually, in the past, those gender differences were overemphasized. And what you're finding is that gender is not as important as we thought previously. Things like your age, things like your socio-demographic group, you know, kind of even whether you're a night person or a day person, all affects risk perhaps as much as gender does. And secondly, more women are risk neutral than men. And therefore, when it comes to making good decisions, as a majority, women are perhaps a little bit better at making decisions when not under stress. And thirdly, that one of the reasons why women are risk averse is that if women do take risky decisions, they're more likely to suffer the consequences for it than men. I mean, those studies are usually around economic theory and in the boardroom. So looking at, say, the Fortune 500 companies, there's not that many women leaders. But if a woman leader has made a risky decision and it's gone wrong, she's more likely to get fired than the guy leader. So actually, there's more negative consequences for women of making riskier decisions than men, because publicly people are less likely to accept it. Okay, let's move on. Unless you have any questions, Erti, do you want to move on to the next slide?
Yeah, we'll move on to the next slide. Yeah.
Okay, so what we have here is an example, and I think a couple of my slides have gone missing from the point where I sent them to you to when we've got it, but I want to talk about this study example, and it's a very, very recent one. So despite the fact that recent studies are saying women are not as risk averse, there's still a lot of body of evidence out there that says that they are slightly more nervous when there's a panic situation. And I think I'm only bringing this up not to put women down, because that would never be my purpose, but just to make us understand the greatness of Hazrat Zainab. You know, there's nobody that's faced a bigger crisis than her. And yet, despite that, her ability to be risk neutral, which we'll go on to discuss later, is absolutely astounding. So one of the biggest studies that we've had recently on risk was people's responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in America, they demonstrated that based on feedback, that women were more likely to be nervous about COVID-19 than men, despite the fact that they actually suffered slightly less consequences. They were more likely to take precaution, more likely to, do social distancing and have a greater sense of kind of what the social consequences were of the pandemic. So even now, despite us being, hundreds and hundreds of years into the future, and we're saying gender is a neutral concept, there is still a huge kind of bias when you look in large case studies of women being more risk averse. And I just wanted to mention that because I want to go on to look at what Hazrat Zainab has done. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. Here is a quote. So when Hazrat Zainab enters Yazid's court, you can imagine it's over 20 days of tireless, merciless journeying. And she has these vulnerable children with her, and what people were expecting would be quite a pitiful sight. Instead, she, in her body language, in her speech, is very, very confident, so much so that Yazid is completely baffled, and he asks the question to the whole court, who is this arrogant woman? And people are so frightened of Yazid, nobody wants to answer the question. And Hazrat Zainab says to him, why are you asking them? Ask me, I'll tell you who I am. I am Muhammad's granddaughter. I'm Fatima's daughter. And I think this one scene really encapsulates how much agency Hazrat Zainab has, how she, despite being in the most vulnerable situation that she could be in, is able to talk for herself, and is able and is reminding Yazid that I don't need anybody else to answer for me. And yeah, so it's giving you a flavor of what is not at all risk averse. If she was, she would have let somebody else answer for her. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, and I think what's very important is that Hazrat Zainab's risk approach is one that was definitely not into risk. You don't see her insulting Yazid or anybody. She's very responsive in what she says. So if he says something, anything that she says is factually based. So people who are prone to risk, they like to escalate the risk in a situation. Hazrat Zainab's language and her stance doesn't escalate the risk, and it doesn't de-escalate the risk. It is factually based. It has historical context, and based on those few things, we can see that it is quite risk neutral. I mean, having said that, it's very, 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 very brave, because her language is that where she's not trying to be popular at all. She's not trying to, like, you can understand when she is, being paraded in the bazaars, and people are talking about her, and talking about the fact that, that these are a bunch of rebels that have been captured by the Caliph of the time. She uses extremely strong language. She says you're an evil nation. She says that, you have no idea what's going to happen to you on the day of resurrection. But she doesn't try to play for public sympathy at all. She is very factual. I'm not sure if I'm actually being able to bring my, to really articulate fully what I'm trying to say. I guess what I'm trying to say is that most studies show us people who like risk sometimes are not necessarily very factual, because they are less likely to, they underplay the consequences of the risky actions that they're taking. Hazrat Zainab fully understands the implications of the actions that she's taking. She knows that she's a prisoner. She knows that, as a prisoner, what she does or doesn't do will, if Yazid is unhappy with her, their conditions can be significantly worse. So she's fully cognizant of kind of her position. But despite that, she uses very proactive language, which is, again, not emotional. It is, on her, as far as she's concerned, telling people exactly what happened, what is going to happen to them, and kind of the gravity of what they've done. It is very factual based, and therefore suggesting that she is quite risk neutral.
Do you think then? So you said that most people that are take risk, they're obviously driven by the emotion. And obviously the adrenaline that comes by taking that risk. So, when you take people that are into high risk activities like, train surfing and things like that, they're obviously driven by the adrenaline that comes out of that. So how does that differ, obviously, from Bibi Zainab's Bibi Zainab's approach in this?
Okay, so there's a number of differences. So firstly, you can see that when Yazid was the first guy to, I mean, he was the first person to ask the question, who is this woman? And she responds. She responds to people when they call out against Imam Hussein. So, you know, when people were kind of throwing stones at the head of the Imam and calling him bad things, she responds to that. You don't see her proactively herself first engaging in any kind of speech. She is answering their questions and their comments, and she keeps her answers and to specifically to what they're saying. So, you know, if she's asked, how do you feel about the fact that our family has victory over your family, or that today Allah has granted us this victory over you, she responds specifically to that point. She refutes the point, but she doesn't then escalate it by saying, oh, and another thing, blah, 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 which tends to be what happens when you are risk seeking, because, you know, you are running exactly on that adrenaline, and you are not necessarily thinking about what you're saying. Whereas if you look at her speech patterns, they're really well constructed. They start with, you know, in one of the sermons, it starts with her talking about how great God is, how she sees just Allah's beauty. And then from there, she goes on into the merits of her family and the merits of martyrdom. It's a very, very structured response, specifically to the points that have been raised. There is, although what she says is very emotion evoking, it is not, it's not based on any kind of over heightened emotion. What she is saying is very, she's very much in control of her speech pattern. Just as Imam Zain al-Abidin is, despite how much they're being provoked. And you have to remember that they were provoked, one, by the fact that, you know, they are in the court of their enemy. Two, they're being made to stand while while the enemy is reclining on these cushions. Three, they're being provoked by the visuals of the heads of their martyrs being, you know, beaten. They're doing absolutely everything possible to provoke a reaction out of them that's uncontrolled, that is hysterical, that does not make sense. But in none of her responses does Hazrat Zainab rise to that, which shows to us, you know, and she's extremely brave. She still calls him the worst of the worst. She's not in any way, you know, she's saying, and again, same thing in Kufa, you know, it's the people of Kufa. She's like, you know, you've absolutely bought for yourselves the worst outcome on the day of judgment. She's not hiding anything, but equally she's doing it in a very structured manner.
Just in the interest of time, I would think with that.
Let's move on to the next. Let's move on to the next.
Move on to the next, and start to move to the end of the discussion.
Okay. Absolutely. So by God, you know, again, her comment to Yazid, by God, you are a liar. By God, you are too lowly born. So in really small, simple sentences, she's encapsulating, one, that, you know, everything is about Allah, and you know, she's using Allah as her witness. There is nobody more powerful than that. And secondly, you know, confirming publicly that Yazid is a liar, and that actually, you know, he's acting as if he is, you know, the most powerful person, but actually he comes from a pretty low place in terms of his origins. Let's move on. So why is this important? And I think it is with a lot of pain that you consider when we have personalities like Hazrat Zainab and such amazing thought leaders, how we're kind of in a position right now in the Muslim world where women are very much at risk. If we look at, there's numerous studies, and I think perhaps the presentation has a couple of links in it as well, as to where women are at most danger right now in the world. Out of the top 10 countries in 2022, 7 of them are countries with populations that are predominantly Muslim populations. It's only Central Africa and Ukraine, and I think where else? One more place, South Sudan, which are not Muslim countries, where women have really, really high risk, difficult, challenging lives. So let's move on to the next slide. And I think that brings me back to the first point. Hazrat Zainab's concept of her brother's revolution was not one that was time bound. That messaging is relevant for us today as well. You know, in order for Imam Hussein's message about true Islam to be remembered, I mean, I think that's something where on one side, you know, we see the majlises, we see the books, we see seminars like this taking place, and the message is one that, you know, if anything is expanding. But on one side, you have the expansion of that message. On the other side, we as individuals, just as Hazrat Zainab was a risk owner as part of that revolution, each one of us is a risk owner. You know, we need to contribute to that revolution in ways that we best know how. And I think, like you were saying, it's playing to our strengths and understanding what our personal risks are, and therefore what our risk approach is. Am I risk averse? Am I risk neutral? You know, kind of how do I approach things? What risks do I own as part of this revolution? Being able to contribute to it. What should I be doing? And I think that is something where we can look to Hazrat Zainab's example as an inspiration. And it shouldn't be a passive thing. Like, coming back to the fact that right now, you know, I think there was a United Nations report that came out a year or so ago, which said every few hours, at least 6 women are killed by people that know them. You know, the amount of poverty and you know, the amount of young girls that are not going to school, the amount of people that have, you know, just really, really horrific living conditions is increasing exponentially. And we as followers of Hazrat Zainab, you know, we need to take inspiration from her message, and in terms of how she looked after the young girls, and you know, kind of how she stood up to tyranny. And I think it's really important. My specific message would be to the women who are listening to this talk about what we need to be doing, and really trying to understand what Hazrat Zainab's legacy is for us, so we can support our sisters out there who are going through a really tough time.
Fantastic, thank you for that. I think just obviously a couple of questions that have come to mind from the discussion. So what was the difference in Bibi Zainab's risk strategy and approach to risk between Karbala and Sham, and how did that shift? And
Okay.
where, if we can kind of identify a moment where it shifted.
So I think her, you know, she was very, very responsive. So in Karbala, you see the focus being on things like getting water to the children, the practical logistics of things. And, you know, of course, with Hazrat Abbas not being there anymore, like you said, she took over the logistics of who gets water and when. Of course, Yazid's army made sure that the supplies that they got was less than adequate. Equally, Hazrat Zainab was tending to the wounds. So it was all around kind of, how do I minimize loss of life? How do I make sure that we have enough people here who witnessed what went on to be able to transport us to Sham, to be able to, promote the message of the revolution that Imam Hussein started. So in Karbala, where there wasn't a huge audience, you don't see Hazrat Zainab being as vocal. She's very insular. She's trying to protect the psychological well-being of the young people that she's in charge of. Again, she's trying to motivate Imam Zain al-Abidin and you know, kind of help him get physically ready for what is going to be a 20-day plus tough journey. Then once you get to Sham, it becomes a lot more about letting the people know exactly what they have done and what the price they are going to pay for doing this. So telling, or even before that, you know, when she's at Kufa, you know, the message becomes, what you have done has absolutely ruined your lives. You think where our lives are ruined, our lives are absolutely fine. We're going to be okay. You need to think about how you're going to face my grandfather, the Prophet. You need to think about kind of the fact that in order to save, either make a bit of money or just to save your family or your personal security, you have let this happen to the Prophet's family. So it's all about messaging to them as to the gravity of what's happened. And then when it comes to Sham, it flips again. And the message becomes, well, actually, you think what you've done is really, really, really significant, but time is going to show what you've done accounts for nothing, because my family will continue to promote the message of Allah. My family has always been there for martyrdom. So you get how each time there's a shift of influence. So going to telling the general public what they've done is terrible, to telling Yazid what he's done is insignificant. And each time how she does that shows that, you know, her risk strategy is actually pretty much messaging the right thing at the right time, but that message has to change.
Absolutely. That was phenomenal. Thank you. And just in the interest of time now, we need to draw the session to a close. And thank you very much for this fantastic fantastic talk that you've given us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Irtaza. You take care, and thank you for giving me the time and the opportunity to speak to you and everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, for joining. I hope you've been able to take some key things away from our discussion today. And inshallah, we'll look forward to joining you soon. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajal. Thank you.